Falling in love is beautiful, and it always starts with a first date. But after going through these cases, I'm not so sure anymore. From a drunk man who struck his first date to a woman who stepped too close to the edge to impress someone she barely knew, ending in the most unforgettable way possible. It was October 12, 2019, in a retail car park on the outskirts of Manchester, England, early evening. The space was partially lit, working well enough in some sections and dropping off in others. The kind of place nobody pays attention to until something happens in it that cannot be undone. Julian Teal was 38 and worked as a delivery supervisor. He was addicted to alcohol, but he had not always been. When he married Sandra, he did not have the habit. It developed slowly over the years of the marriage, a drink at the end of the day that became two, then more, then something he was organizing his evenings around without fully realizing it. Sandra had married the version of him that existed before it took hold and had stayed as it changed, trying to manage around it, covering where she could, and holding on to the calm stretches between the difficult periods as evidence that things might still turn around. They did not turn around. The thing that ended the marriage happened on a January night the year before. Sandra was upstairs asleep. She had put Lily down in her cot earlier in the evening. Julian had been drinking since the afternoon. At some point that night, Lily woke and cried, and Julian picked her up and carried her outside onto the porch and left her there. Lily was 4 months old. Julian went back inside and the door closed behind him, dulling the sound, and time passed. A neighbor heard the crying after a long while and came out and found her in the cold and brought her inside and called Sandra. Lily survived without lasting harm. Sandra left the next morning and did not come back. I want to be fair to the version of Julian that existed before all of this, but a 4-month-old on a porch in January is where my fairness runs out. Julian got sober. It took more than one attempt and several months, but he held it for around 8 months. He contacted Sandra twice asking to reconcile. She said no both times, not unkindly, just clearly. He did not push it. The sobriety he built during that period had been held together by routine and structure, avoiding anything that felt unfamiliar or socially pressured. He had not been on a date. He had not put himself in a situation that felt like normal life resuming. The pattern underneath had not gone anywhere. It had just not been tested. He met Christine Addo at a supermarket on a Tuesday afternoon in October. They reached for the same item on the shelf and ended up exchanging numbers before they left. They talked for 3 weeks after that, calls in the evening and messages during the day, getting to know each other slowly. Christine was 34 and worked as a project coordinator. Over those 3 weeks, she had only seen the steady version of him and had no reason to think there was another one. The date was set for a Saturday. It was the first time in 8 months he was stepping back into something that felt like ordinary life, and the anxiety around it was more than he had expected. By early afternoon, he had already opened a bottle. He told himself it was just one drink to take the edge off. By the time he left the house, it had been more than one. Christine noticed something was off within the first hour. She did not say much about it, but she had quietly adjusted what she expected the evening to be. And by the time they reached the car park, she had already decided she was not getting in the car with him and had her phone out to arrange her own way home. This is where everything took a devastating turn. Julian got into his SUV. Christine stayed outside, stepping back as she paced during the call, moving toward better signal without paying attention to where she was placing herself. She had ended up near the edge of the driving lane behind the car without realizing it. The car park had uneven lighting, some sections fine and others darker, and the area behind Julian's vehicle was one of the darker ones. Julian started the engine and reversed without properly checking his mirrors and without doing a shoulder check. The car caught Christine at low speed. The contact knocked her off her feet, and she fell backward, and her head hit the tarmac hard. The car rolled a short distance further before Julian braked. He sat for a moment before getting out. A driver who had just parked nearby saw what had happened and came over and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived quickly. Christine had a severe head injury. They worked on her at the scene and then took her to hospital where they kept trying. Christine Addo was pronounced dead that evening. CCTV from the car park showed enough of the sequence to confirm what had happened. Julian's blood alcohol was above the legal limit. He was arrested at the scene without resistance, charged with causing death by careless driving under the influence of drink, and pleaded guilty at his hearing. The sentence took into account his history and the circumstances. Sandra was told by someone who knew them both. She did not attend the hearing, and made no public statement. Lily was 2 years old when the verdict came down. She would not remember any of it. I wonder if Lily will ever get to know her father. Meanwhile, at a restaurant in Phoenix, a first date that had been building for 8 months ended in the most devastating way. It was March 25, 2018, a mid-range restaurant in Phoenix, Arizona, on a busy Saturday evening. Most tables were occupied, and the entrance had a short staircase leading down from the main dining floor to the exit. The floor along that route was tiled and in continuous use as guests arrived and left throughout the night. The transition from tile to the stair edge was smooth and uncarpeted, with a metal nosing on each step. Vanessa Cole was 31 and owned a salon in Scottsdale. The man sitting across from her had introduced himself online as Mac Maddox, 34, a senior project engineer at a well-known infrastructure firm in Denver. He had sent her the first message. She had not gone looking for him. His profile was polished and specific, photos with expensive cars, a Range Rover in one and a Mercedes in another, well-fitted clothes in every picture. A height he listed as 6'2". Over the 8 months they had been talking, he had sent flowers to her salon twice, real arrangements with her name on the card. He had sent jewelry, a bracelet, and a watch, both arriving in branded packaging that looked legitimate. She wore the bracelet the night she went to meet him. When he told her he had booked 5 days off work to come to Phoenix, she did not hesitate. She made the reservation at one of the better restaurants in the area. She had been seated at a table with a clear line of sight to the entrance. She saw him before he reached the host stand. He was noticeably shorter than his listed height, the difference clear even across the room. The clothes he was wearing were creased and poorly fitted, nothing resembling any photo he had ever sent her. He looked like a different person. She watched him scan the room and find her, and she did not smile when their eyes met. 8 months. And that was what walked through the door? I just can't help but wonder how she felt at that very moment. He sat down, and she gave him a chance to explain. She asked about the Range Rover. He said it belonged to a friend. She asked about the Mercedes. Same answer. She asked about the firm he claimed to work for, and the answers that followed were vague in a way that specific employment details are not when they are real. By the time the starters arrived, she understood that almost nothing she had been shown across 8 months of near-daily conversation had been accurate. The flowers had been real. The jewelry had arrived in the right boxes. Everything else had held at a distance and failed in person. The evening did not recover from that point. Vanessa's tone shifted and became more public. There were corrections directed at staff that drew attention from nearby tables, brief exchanges that carried further than they should have. The man across from her said very little. He had stopped trying to manage the situation. A corrected drink was returned to the table. There was a short exchange with the server. The server responded directly, disagreeing with Vanessa's account of the order. Vanessa repeated herself. The server did not change her position. It was a small exchange in ordinary circumstances, but it was the last one. Vanessa pushed her chair back and stood. She picked up her glass and threw it to the floor. It shattered on the tile, and the tables nearby went quiet. She took her bag and turned immediately toward the exit. The manager was already moving in her direction. She was wearing heeled shoes and moving quickly. She reached the top of the entrance staircase without slowing, her attention still partly behind her. As she stepped onto the first stair, Mac came up behind her and took hold of her wrist. He said her name and told her to wait. The contact came as her weight was already moving forward. She pulled her arm back. Her foot slipped on the edge of the step. Her hand went out toward the railing but did not reach it. She lost balance and fell forward down the staircase. There was no controlled descent. Her body turned as she went down, and her head struck the edge of a lower step before she reached the bottom. She did not get up. A nearby guest told others not to move her as staff cleared the area and called emergency services. Mac remained at the top of the stairs. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and took over the scene. Vanessa was transported to hospital in critical condition. She was stabilized briefly on arrival. Imaging showed a severe head injury with significant internal bleeding. The clinical team continued treatment through the night, but the damage was not survivable. Vanessa Cole died in hospital in the early hours of the following morning. Mac Maddox gave an account to responding officers at the scene. He provided a contact number and stated that he had tried to stop her as she was leaving. He was not detained at that time. CCTV footage reviewed during the investigation showed brief contact at the wrist and no clear pushing motion. The The footage was consistent with a loss of balance during her pull-away. No criminal charges were filed. In the weeks following her burial, her family went through her belongings. The bracelet and watch that had arrived in branded packaging was taken to be valued and was identified as knockoffs. Vanessa didn't survive the evening she thought would be her best. The next one is different. Same city as a million other first dates, raining hard, and a phone sitting just below the waterline. It was June 14, 2017. Mumbai was in the middle of its monsoon season and had been raining heavily since mid-afternoon. By evening, water had begun collecting across low-lying sections of the western suburbs, slowing traffic and pushing drivers into smaller connecting roads that usually stayed passable. Arjun Mehta was 31 and worked as a marketing executive in Andheri. Priya Nair was 28, a pharmaceutical sales representative who had relocated from Kochi earlier that year. They had matched on an app 6 weeks earlier and had met in person for the first time that evening in Bandra, the kind of first meeting that goes easily without either person having to try too hard. By the time they left, it was fully dark and the rain had not let up. Arjun knew a connecting lane that cut through to the main road and had used it before in the rain without a problem. The entrance looked the same as it always had. Water across the surface, but nothing that suggested it was deeper than usual. There were no depth markers and no warning sign. He turned in. The vehicle moved about 130 feet before it reached the lowest point of the lane. As the car rolled into the depression, its forward motion pushed a bow wave along both sides, and the water rose against the doors faster than it had appeared from the entrance. It came up past the door sills and reached the engine intake, and the car stalled. Arjun tried to restart it twice. It did not respond. Water was already coming in through the door seals and the floor points, rising steadily inside the cabin. The road had a slight tilt, and the driver's side sat marginally higher than the passenger side. Arjun got his window down while the electrics were still working and pushed himself out and reached the raised edge of the lane. Priya tried her door, and it would not move against the external water load and flow, the unequal pressure across the panel making it immovable from the inside. She tried the window controls, and by then the water had reached the lower dashboard and the electrics had gone. Arjun came back to the vehicle and got to the rear door from the higher side. It opened a few inches against the flow before the pressure eased enough to push it further. He reached in and tried to pull Priya across the back seat, but the confined space and the rising water made movement difficult and slow. A nearby resident had come out with a rope and threw it toward the vehicle. The first throw fell short and drifted off in the current. The second connected, but Priya's grip was wet and unstable and she could not secure it cleanly on the first attempt. She got hold of it properly on the second and was pulled toward the raised edge in increments, the current working against every move. She got out. He went back into the water for her. He got her out. That part of this case is the part I cannot put down because of what he did next. The vehicle was effectively submerged by then. Arjun was standing at the edge of the stable section when he turned back toward the car. His phone was visible near the center console just below the waterline. He stepped forward onto the submerged surface to reach it. The water was murky, and the ground beneath it was not visible. His foot came down on what was likely the edge of a drain lip or a subsurface curb break and lost purchase immediately. He tried a second step to stabilize himself, and it did not hold. The channeled flow through the narrow lane had enough lateral force to prevent him from recovering his stance, and he went sideways off the raised edge into the deeper section. The water took him along the lane, away from where Priya and the resident were standing. He surfaced once and went under again. The murky water and the darkness made it impossible to track him from the edge, and by the time anyone could get the rope redirected, he was already beyond reach. Emergency services received the first call and arrived approximately 11 minutes later, consistent with response times across the city that evening, given the flood conditions. Priya was conscious and was treated for shock and mild hypothermia at the scene. Arjun was located further along the same lane, carried by the flow. He was transported to hospital and pronounced dead. The cause of death was recorded as accidental drowning following floodwater vehicle entry. The investigation found no foul play, and the circumstances were consistent with a single accidental event. The lane had previously been identified by the authorities as flood-prone during heavy rainfall. Warning markers had been planned for the location, but had not been installed at the time of the incident. And this is the part that broke my heart. After the incident, it was installed. Arjun went back for his phone and did not come back from it. While at a resort beach in Cancun, two people who had known each other less than 24 hours, and a boundary on the water that both of them could still see. It was the 27th of December, 2016, a resort beach in Cancun, late morning. The water had a light chop, and the sun was already high enough to flatten contrast on the surface, making distances harder to judge than they appeared. The rental area was marked with buoys, but the boundary was not being actively enforced that morning, and riders had been drifting beyond it for most of the session without being called back. Sophie Larner was 25 and on holiday from Germany. Rafael Diaz was 27 and worked at a hotel in the resort. They had met the night before and decided to rent jet skis the next morning. Neither of them had much experience on the machine. The safety briefing from the rental company was brief and mostly procedural. After about 20 minutes on the water, they had drifted well outside the marked area. The buoys were still visible behind them, but distant enough to feel irrelevant. Neither of them turned back. The buoys were still visible. They could see exactly where the boundary was. That is what I kept coming back to. It was not that they lost track of it. They just stopped treating it as something that applied to them. They had been riding alongside each other, roughly matching speeds. Their attention pulled more toward each other than toward the wider water. The speed had crept up gradually, the way it does when neither rider explicitly decides to go faster, but neither checks it either. Glare off the water and intermittent spray reduced contrast and made other riders harder to pick out, especially at low angles between waves. A third rider was crossing from Sophie's left at a steady, moderate speed. He had identified Raphael as a reference point, but had not clearly resolved Sophie's position. She was slightly behind and offset, intermittently obscured by chop and sitting lower in his line of sight. From Sophie's perspective, the movement to her left registered late. For a brief moment, she misread the other rider's path and hesitated, easing the throttle and starting a correction that did not fully commit in either direction. That hesitation shortened what was already a limited reaction window. None of the three riders had a clear sense of the closing speed. Each of them made a partial adjustment, but not enough to create separation. The machines came together at an oblique angle, the forward quarter of one striking the side of the other. The impact threw Sophie and the third rider from their machines. Raphael turned back toward them, entered the disturbed water at speed, crossed the intersecting wake, and lost stability, falling off shortly after. Rescue staff reached the area roughly 10 minutes after the incident was reported and the location confirmed. The third rider had broken ribs and a shoulder injury. Raphael had a head injury and multiple cuts and was taken to hospital. Sophie's injuries were consistent with a high-speed collision and secondary impact with the water. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Her two friends were on the beach when it happened. Resort staff informed them within the hour. The authorities was contacted that evening, and her family in Munich was notified the following morning. The investigation reviewed the rental company's safety procedures and the supervision of the marked riding area at the time. The company suspended operations for 6 days during the review and later resumed with additional on-water supervision during operating hours. Rafael Diaz returned to Guadalajara 2 weeks later after giving his statement. He had known Sophie for less than a day. Sophie's case ended in open water nobody was supervising, but in Orlando, a date meant to end in fun took a tragic turn. It was the 21st of July, 2014, Orlando, a large theme park on a summer afternoon, the heat heavy and the crowds thick, the kind of day where the noise and the pace of the place make it easy to move through decisions faster than you normally would. Dana Reeves was 26 years old. She worked as a dental hygienist. She had moved to Orlando from Tennessee 2 years before for work. Kevin Soares was 29. He worked as a shift supervisor at a warehouse. He had grown up in Orlando. They had met 3 weeks earlier at a cookout through a shared friend. Kevin suggested the theme park for their first date. He wanted it to feel fun and different. Dana liked the idea. They spent the first 2 hours on smaller rides and eating food. They were relaxed and comfortable with each other. In the afternoon, Kevin took them to the park's biggest roller coaster. It was one of the fastest in the state. It had many loops and drops. The park took safety seriously on this ride. There was a sign at the entrance listing size and body requirement. A worker at the gate gave a safety talk. Kevin walked through before it was finished. Dana stopped at the sign. She told Kevin the harness had not felt right when she tried something like it before. He told her she was thinking too much about it and that she would be fine. They had only known each other for 3 weeks. He seemed sure of himself. She did not want to cause a problem. She got on the ride. She stopped at the board and said the words out loud. I keep wondering what the afternoon looks like if she just says no. At the loading area, Dana did not sit all the way back in her seat. Her hips were slightly forward. Her lower back was not flat against the seat. When the safety harness came down, it locked in place. But because of how she was sitting, there was a small gap between her body and the harness. A worker checked that the harness was locked. It was locked. But the check could not catch the gap inside caused by her posture. The harness felt tight to her. From where the workers stood on the platform, her position looked normal. Nothing seemed wrong. The ride was loading quickly. Workers were watching many rows at once. The small gap between her back and the seat did not look like a clear problem. What the workers could not see was that the harness had locked higher on her body than it should have. This meant her upper body was not held as firmly as it needed to be. Her head and neck could move more than they should during the ride. The ride started. The first part went normally. For most of the ride, her body stayed mostly in place. But as the ride went through fast and sharp turns, the gap inside the harness allowed her body to shift. She would lift slightly into the harness and then be pushed back down. This happened more than once. These movements were small, but they were not smooth. During turns and transitions, her head and neck were not being held steadily. Instead of the force spreading evenly across her body, her neck was taking sharp hits of force without support. Near the end of the ride, one of these movements likely bent her neck too far and too fast. No single factor caused what happened next. Her seating posture had created the gap. The gap had caused the harness to lock at its minimum engagement point, rather than flush against her body. That meant her upper body had been moving with less restraint than the ride was designed to allow. And underneath all of it was a weakness in her connective tissue that she had never been diagnosed with and had no reason to suspect. Each factor on its own might not have been enough. Together, they were. Near the end of the ride, Dana stopped responding. The train finished its course and stopped automatically at the end. Workers reached the train after it stopped. They found Dana unresponsive. She was not sitting the way she had been at the start. Emergency services were called. She was taken to a hospital. Dana Reeves was pronounced dead that evening. Doctors found that an artery in her neck had torn. This was caused by the extreme neck movement during the ride. The hidden tissue weakness made her more vulnerable to that kind of injury. Investigators said the combination of the harness locking at its minimum point and her poor seating position created too much movement inside the harness. That caused the force to hit her neck too hard during one of the transitions. Dana's family sued the park. The case was settled privately. The ride reopened after changes were made. Workers were given clearer steps to check that riders were sitting fully back in their seat. Riders were also given clearer instructions on how to sit and how to check that the harness fit correctly. Kevin Suarez was treated at the scene for shock. He never went to a theme park again. Dana said something was wrong before she ever got on the ride. The last case I want to cover is the one that stayed with me longest. A woman who had been to that place many times, brought someone she wanted to impress, but ended up in a worse state. It was April 9th, 2018. The Cliffs of Moher, County Clare, Ireland, early afternoon. The sky was overcast, and the Atlantic wind was coming in from the west, in the irregular way it does on that stretch of coast, with short lulls between gusts that made the conditions feel more stable than they were. Ciara Brennan was 27 and taught primary school in Galway. She had been to the Cliffs of Moher many times and knew the site well, or believed she did. James Whitfield was 29, an architect from London, who had extended his stay in Ireland after a conference and matched with Ciara online about 2 weeks before they met. They had been talking consistently in the days leading up to the visit. Ciara had suggested the cliffs. She wanted to show him something she was proud of from where she was from. That detail hit me. She brought him there to show him something she loved about where she was from. But what happened later changed everything. They arrived in the early afternoon. The visitor path was maintained, and the barrier and warning signs were clearly posted at the points where the managed area ended and the unprotected terrain began. They took photographs within the designated area for a while, before Ciara began moving towards sections with fewer people. The familiarity she had with the location reduced the weight of the signage for her. She had stood near the edge before on previous visits, and nothing had happened. The warnings had become background rather than instruction. She stepped past the signage. James stayed on the safe path at first, then moved closer for a better angle, stopping about 10 feet behind her and slightly to her left. Ciara was a few steps from the edge, her body angled toward the camera, her weight slightly forward, and her stance not fully planted. The terrain beyond the barrier was uneven limestone, with a slight slope toward the edge and a layer of patchy grass over thin soil that did not sit firmly on the rock beneath it. The instability was not obvious from looking at the surface. Wind at the cliff edge behaves differently from conditions on the path. The drop creates updraft, and the gusts that reach the edge tend to arrive with more force and less warning than they feel from further back. A sudden, strong gust of wind hit her very quickly. She was leaning forward on a slight slope. Her front foot slipped because the thin grass moved on the rock underneath. She tried to correct her balance, but her other foot also couldn't grip properly. At that point, she had leaned too far forward to recover her balance. James reacted immediately, but the 10 feet between them was too much. He reached the barrier and extended his arm, but there was nothing to reach. The fall occurred at approximately 2:47 in the afternoon. Witnesses nearby responded within seconds, and emergency calls were made immediately. James was treated at the scene for shock and minor abrasions. The recovery operation was constrained by the cliff access limitations and the tidal conditions along the base. Ciara Brennan's body was recovered the following morning. The relevant authority reviewed the incident as part of its ongoing monitoring of cliff path safety compliance. The section where the incident occurred was already within a designated warning zone. No barrier breach, structural failure, or path maintenance issue was identified as a contributing factor. Ciara Brennan had grown up an hour away. She had brought people here to show them something she loved about where she was from. She had stood near that edge before, and nothing had happened.